We think of reading aloud as a skill that we acquire. As a civilization, it's the other way around. We started out reading out loud and then acquired the skill of reading silently. We'll talk about that in the first segment of today's show, and then we will talk to one of the superstars of the audiobook world about how she reads a book to us. And spoiler, she doesn't just read it, she performs it. And then we'll talk about a marathon reading out loud of the work of one of America's most beloved poets, who only wrote about, 1,500 poems. So it does take a while to read all of them. A meditation and conversation about reading aloud on today's show after this news.
We'll be close as pages in a book, my love and I, so close we can share a single look, share every sigh. So close that before I hear your laugh, my laugh breaks through.
So close as pages in a book. We think of pages in a book as something that we read silently and perhaps sing about from time to time. But yes, that idea of reading silently is sort of the default position these days. That's how you read unless somebody asks you to read out loud or you insist on doing it. But as you'll hear here in the first segment, that isn't necessarily the way things started out. And you'll also hear in the second segment from somebody who is really just an unquestioned master of reading/performing books as audiobooks. And then at the end, you'll hear about a marathon reading of the poems of Emily Dickinson. And at the slightest prompting, speaking of music, I will be happy to sing an Emily Dickinson song to the tune of Yellow Rose of Texas. That's not really in the script, but I'm hoping I get a chance to do it. You could do that with most of them. I'm not saying that's how she planned it, but you could do it with most of them. All right, but here to actually introduce some information and thoughtfulness into this conversation, Alberto Manguel is the director of Lisbon's Center for Research into the History of Reading. And he joins us to talk about, in fact, that evolution of reading from aloud to silent. It's that way, not the other way around. Welcome to our conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
So let's just talk a little bit about this. I mean, you can almost tell from the early stirrings of literature that it's probably kind of meant to be read out loud. We think Homer, may not even be just one person and may have been a series of people who went around saying things. I mean, at the beginning of the Aeneid, it's arma virumque cano. I sing of arms and a man. It's not I write of arms and a man. So, I assume what we're talking about is an aloud tradition at the beginning of reading.
You are starting about 3,000 years too late. The psychologist Julian Jaynes wrote about the bicameral mind and the origin of consciousness. And his theory is that when we started putting words into writing, when the first traces of writing appeared, when we looked at those traces, when we read, the reading did not come to us silently. They were not visual hallucinations, but they were oral hallucinations. You heard the sounds of the signs inscribed in stone or in clay. So at the beginning of writing, the sound of the words existed for us in their presence.
And just to fast forward, since our time is short, so one of the reasons we know that reading was done almost entirely aloud is that when Saint Augustine encounters someone who's reading silently, he goes, "Wow, that's weird. I haven't seen that before." Tell us that story.
Yeah, there are a few examples of the surprise that people had when they encountered silent reading. The most famous one is Saint Augustine. Saint Augustine goes to Milan. He visits his mother's friend, Ambrose. He visits Ambrose in Ambrose's cell. The man is surrounded with books. And Augustine in the Confessions says, but his lips were not moving. His tongue was silent, but it was obvious that he was reading. So reading about Augustine's surprise, we understand that reading silently was unusual. It wasn't impossible, because in another passage of the Confessions, Augustine tells us that he's reading silently, so it wasn't impossible. What happens unto about the 9th century, because words were written in capital letters, there were no punctuation marks, or very few. Letters were not separated, words were not separated. In order to decipher a text that you came across for the first time, you would speak it out loud, as you would today if you encountered that kind of text. But silent reading didn't start until, to be common, until about the 9th century, where we have the punctuation marks and the separation of words that allow us to read with more ease.
And so we think of libraries as very quiet places where people are supposed to shh so everybody else can concentrate on what they're reading silently. But this all suggests that the library at Alexandria was probably not the most quiet place in the world.
Probably not. We know nothing about Alexandria because of all the reports that have come to us about the city of Alexandria. When the travelers come to describe the library, well, they say it's so famous we don't need to talk about it. Well,
that's not helpful.
So we have nothing that describes what was happening in the library, but we can assume that it wasn't a reading out loud, as if I read to you out loud, communicating a text to you. It was probably a kind of murmur that you would hear in the Quranic school or Talmudic school, where the students read, so to speak, with the whole body. So you mouth the words, you touch the book, you rock to the sound of the text. So it might have been something like that.
So when do we really get into the sense, the almost default understanding that reading should be silent unless prompted to do otherwise? When does that shift happen?
Around the 9th century, it has become common. Monks in monasteries were supposed to read and study the scripture, but they would do it silently, except during meal times where it was read out loud. And then it becomes common, it becomes a sign of education. You were a literate, educated person if you read silently. And reading out loud becomes a dangerous practice, because reading silently was considered dangerous in the beginning because you didn't know what the person was doing. And so heretics were supposed to get their heretical ideas by reading silently. But later on, much later on, in the 19th century, for instance, there was a law in the United States forbidding slaves to read, and forbidding, above all, the teaching of slaves to read. And the slaves discovered or created certain strategies to be able to learn to read. And so we have very moving accounts, like Thomas Johnson, who became a very well-known preacher in England afterwards. He couldn't read, and he found the strategy of asking his master's son, who was as a child learning to read and reading out loud and praising the reading out loud of the child. So through that, Johnson managed to learn to read, and that was considered dangerous and forbidden.
So there's almost, and reading your piece about this, a sort of vague undercurrent of Christian and maybe specifically Protestant constipation and suppression about all this. I mean, you towards the end say that all this silent reading, a host of silent readers who over the next many centuries would include Luther, would include Calvin, would include Emerson, would include us reading him today. There's maybe this sense that, that you don't read out loud. Well, I mean, Luther was actually constipated, but I mean, you don't read out loud because it's more modest and less sinful to just read in silence, more holy?
It's ambiguous. Reading silently meant that no one knew what you were reading, and you can read forbidden texts and comment on them in your mind. But reading out loud was a way of counteracting the censorship of silent reading, and you could share your reading, your discoveries with others. And reading out loud has many takes on many forms. That is to say, reading out loud to a colleague with whom you want to share what you have discovered silently, reading out loud to a child that you want to entertain, reading out loud to a lover with whom you want to share that very private thing that is a beloved text, or reading out loud as a performance. There is an anecdote I like very much in the first century, Livy, the Pliny the Younger. Pliny the Younger, in one of his letters, says that he was a very bad reader out loud. He performed very badly. So in one event where he had to read some of his text to a public, he put a curtain behind him, and he got a slave who could read very well, stand behind the curtain and read the text for him. And Pliny would mouth the words. It was the first lip sync in history.
The original Milli Vanilli. It was Pliny Vanilli. So, yeah, I mean, I'm amazed that Plautus didn't turn that into a comedy. It has something kind of theatrical about it, that story. So one thing that occurred to me is that a modern poet, you almost can't make a living. You almost can't have a career as a modern poet. I'd say really maybe for the last 125 years minimum, if you don't do readings, if you don't go places where you read your poetry aloud to audiences. I mean, it really is just baked in. We're going to be talking about Emily Dickinson at the end of the show, who would be the exception to that rule, obviously. But I wondered about that. Is poetry always kind of carved out that way as, yes, this is something that to be understood, just the same way that Shakespeare's speeches and plays need to be heard to be understood? Is it always sort of understood that poetry has its own category?
In some cases, poetry is intimately associated with song and with music. So certainly in Greece and Rome, they were performances. And when we read the text now, we read, as it were, the script of an opera without the staging, without the music. But it happens with other forms of writing. Throughout the 19th century, writers of novels gave performances. The performances of Dickens were very, very celebrated. He acted out the voices of his different characters, and he put so much enthusiasm in it. So every reading, he would have to change his shirt several times. It was soaked with sweat.
Yeah, well, I'm sitting here about 4 blocks from the home of Mark Twain, who also obviously had a tremendous career, just reading his own work and and
Yes.
giving speeches and the translation of the work into sound. I just wanted to come back to Emerson for a second because I was just I'm a big Emerson fan. I don't want to sound like I'm making fun of him.
I am too.
Yeah, and he's much more of an ecstatic, than, say, Luther or Calvin would have been. And there is something in the quote that you have from him, there's something a little erotic and, dare I say, maybe onanistic about the way he describes reading in silence and in privacy. He says, but they are for the closet and are to be read on bended knee. Their communications are not to be given or taken with the lips and the end of the tongue, but out of the glow of the cheek and with the throbbing heart. This is this is a pretty passionate statement.
For the rest of his life, he associated Plato with the smell of wool because his blanket covered him up to the chin. But there is something erotic in reading. You don't take anything with you into bed, and you take a book into bed. And it has something erotic in the fact that you commune with the text, hold it in your hands, use your lips to speak it. I agree with Emerson.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's hard to disagree with the way that he expresses it there, too. So I just have to say, you have one of the more remarkable reading aloud to somebody else stories in the modern world, probably. And this involves the great Jorge Luis Borges. Tell us that story.
I was an adolescent working in a bookstore in Buenos Aires. Borges came to the bookstore. He would buy books. He was accompanied by his 90-year-old mother. And at a certain point, his mother got too tired to read to him. Borges had become blind in his mid-50s. So Borges would ask anyone to come and read to him what he wanted to revisit. And so one day he asked me if I would come to his house in the evening and read to him. And I said yes. And I did that for the next 3 years.
Well, I mean, first of all, that would make me very nervous. And was he, I don't know, did he give you stage instructions? Did he say, Alberto, no, you're going too fast or something like that?
Well, he didn't want any kind of interpretation. When he became blind, he had decided that he would write poetry because poetry came to him like a music and he could dictate the words to that music afterwards, but that he would not write prose because he said he needed to see his hand writing prose. But ideas came to him for stories and for essays. And so after 10 years, this was in the mid-60s that I met him, he decided that he would go back to writing prose. But before that, he wanted to revisit the stories that he had read earlier and that he thought were masterpieces. And he wanted to revisit them because he wanted to understand technically how they worked. It was like a mechanic taking apart a motor. And so I was taking apart the motor for him. I read to him Chesterton, Stevenson, Henry James, and so on. And Borges would listen to the reading, the texts were chosen by Borges, and he would interrupt after a sentence or two and make a comment about the structure, about the use of a certain word, about the tone. But these were comments for him. They were not comments for me. I had the privilege, I didn't know it at the time that it was a privilege. I had the privilege of assisting to the reading of one of the great minds of the 20th century.
It's an amazing, amazing thing. We have to stop there, although there's plenty more to say with Alberto Manguel, the director of Lisbon's Center for Research into the History of Reading. Thank you so much for your time today. And now we're going to segue into, just as we go out of this segment, you're going to hear a little sort of comic take on the idea of reading someone else's prose. This will be Drew John Ladd, I guess adapting from David Alan Grier's impression of Maya Angelou, endorsing Butterfinger candy bars.
The wind, the rain, the fire, the Butterfinger. Did the caveman know your delicious goodness? Did the Mayan priest exult in your buttery crunchiness? Did the slothful mastodon upon his extinction declare, don't lay a finger upon my butter finger? Oh, you finger of butter! You proud confection, sugar brown roasted peanuts, fructose, glucose, sucrose, lactose, partially hydrogenated palm kernel oil, crispity, crunchity, peanut buttery. I give myself to you. Butterfinger, glad mantle of golden chocolatey hope upon my breast.
Butterfinger, I let you go, but love still lingers. Why, I don't know.
I'm writing about the book I read. I have to sing about the book I read. I'm embarrassed to admit it. Hit the soft spot in my heart when I found out you wrote the book I read. So take my shoulders and
So we are going to change gears a little tiny bit, but not a lot. And I am going to have a chance to talk to someone I consider a very close personal friend because she spent 10 and a half hours speaking to my ear over the last week or so. And that would be Robin Miles, a Hall of Fame audiobook narrator, really one of the superstars of this world. And she's also a producer, director, teacher, actor for theater, television, films, and museums. And as a personal note, I was listening to her read Dennis Lane's Small Mercies, and I have some very specific questions about that. But first of all, welcome to the show. It's so great to have you.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here.
So we should also just talk a little bit about maybe a distinction, if there is one, between reading and performing. So actually, when you do, for example, Small Mercies, Mr. Audiobook, whoever he is at the beginning, says performed by Robin Miles. And so talk about that.
That's a great place to start, actually, because it's one of the distinctions that I make for my students. And that is reading aloud is a little like a football field. And you have an end zone on the left, which is reading aloud. And you have an end zone on the right, which is performing an audiobook. And then you have this area in the middle, like between the 40-yard line and the 40-yard line, which is the sweet spot for narrating a book. You can never drop the ball and leave emotional threads or irony or levels of meaning on the table. So that leans a little bit more to performance. But reading aloud without the emotionally intelligent part of it is the other end zone of just reading aloud. So I find, and it's really about the author, I have to follow my author's clues as to what does this book need to be read aloud. Does it need a little bit more performance? Does it need a little bit more distance? Can I stay back a bit and really just let you inject your meaning and your judgments on things? I let the text dictate to me.
So I have to get this out of the way because I'm just going to be bursting with eagerness to ask it. It really should come up a little later in the conversation. This isn't even my first date with Robin Miles. I've had you on my phone reading N.K. Jemisin as well. And so Small Mercies, there's no non-awkward way to talk about this. Small Mercies takes place during the busing crisis in Boston during the 1970s. It is written from the perspective of a white woman named Mary Pat Fennessy. You are basically narrating and performing in her voice and then doing also the voices of the people around her, most of whom are white Boston racists who sprinkle the N-word pretty liberally, if that's the right word. Through what they say.
That's it.
And I, although I've heard you before, I just looked at a picture of you today. You appear to be a person of color. It never occurred to me that the person who was doing, I mean, you're so convincing as Mary Pat Fennessy. I was flabbergasted to discover you're not a white lady.
Okay. I think that's a compliment.
It is. It is. Like,
Definitely.
how did you, I don't know. You really you have to project yourself into
To
a very
the
different
character.
kind of person than yourself.
I am a trained actor. I went to Yale Drama School. I've done Broadway and regional, so I know how to tackle character. But I think in this particular instance, it is a little more than that. And I've got to reference how I grew up. I grew up in a little town in New Jersey. In the 60s. My parents moved in 63 before I was even born. And they took a risk moving into a suburban white neighborhood during the time when crosses were being burned on people's lawns. My mom was a professional. My dad was a rising professional. And they took this chance. And our neighbors, particularly my next door neighbor, who was a Scottish farm girl from Seattle area, Washington State, just embraced us. I grew up in this neighborhood where my next door neighbors on one side were Cuban Jews with an accent. My next door neighbor on the other side, farm girl. I got the Washington State accent. The guy who lived behind us, Arthur Weiss, had lived through the camps. He was a watchmaker, German watchmaker. We had this kind of first generation neighborhood. And all the kids were 5 years older. They were my sister's age when I was born. I had nobody to play with except my friend from Vietnam, my Vietnamese. I didn't know she was Vietnamese at the time. I didn't know that till way later. Kim Sue, she lived down the block. She was my pal. And then when she moved, it was Heidi Zinsmeister. And the Altenkos were down at this end of the block. And the Italian family of almost everybody had grandparents who had an accent, including mine from Jamaica. I actually went all the way to college. I went to Yale undergrad. I got there. I thought, oh, wow, it's a big cosmopolitan place, all these people from all over. I thought everybody grew up like that. I thought everybody grew up with like immigrants from every country around them. And I discovered that that was not the case. I did not grow up in segregation, but being a little kid with no other little kids to play with, I was that annoying child that would go down the block and knock on your door and say, hi, I'm here, to the adults, which you'd never think to do these days.
Right.
You know, it just sounds so dangerous. But all the neighbors welcomed in this little black child who was very curious. And I would watch, you know, my neighbor who is an oil painter, I'd sit and watch her paint. Or I would come and talk to them. And I would always go to Mr. Weiss's house at 12 o'clock. Because as a watchmaker, the grandfather clocks and the cuckoo clocks under glass would all go off at noon.
Ooh. So I want to know a little bit about you in the booth. So I read one description of you walking into the booth barefoot, but I think that's because you'd had rain boots on that day. But I want to know, like we just interviewed an expert in the history of reading who talked about sort of there is a history of reading aloud that involves quite a bit of body English, so to speak. And I'm kind of wondering about that. If I were to watch you from outside the booth, in the booth, would I see you moving around quite a bit and gesticulating? Or what are you doing when you're in there?
I have a swivel chair with a post in the center so I can kind of move my body around. It's not a chair with 4 feet. I do gesture, and I think what's probably most animated is my face. Because if I move around too much, I drift off the microphone, off the center. And once you've done that, your voice goes, ah. So you do have to be comfortable in a certain degree of stillness in terms of positioning. But after that, arms gesture. Sometimes I gesture and I whack my mic. I say, and I got to do the thing again. But it's hard for me. I started out actually as a dancer singer. And so my body is really part of how I express anything.
Yeah.
It's very physical.
So in some instances, okay, so for small, let's take the two I've mentioned so far. For Small Mercies, you are recreating as best you can a world that actually did exist, and you are speaking in a Boston accent that is familiar to some of us anyway. But when you're doing the work of kind of a sci-fi fantasy writer like N.K. Jemisin in the fifth season and a whole lot of other books, you are now essentially the voice of N.K. Jemisin narration and dialogue. You're effectively inventing the audio version of a world that nobody's
That
been to.
doesn't exist.
Yes.
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit about that? I mean, you're inventing even accents, sort of regional accents for regions that are not on any map that doesn't belong to N.K. Jemisin.
I'm so glad that you noticed and appreciated that. To start out with Small Mercies, the Irish accent is one that I'm really comfortable with. My next door neighbor's right across the street, Irish family. Lots of Irish families on my block. I also babysat for. And one of my friends' moms, Mrs. Pickering, had a very strong Southern Irish accent. So I grew up listening to that. And it's just turned out that the Irish community and the Black community have had a lot of contact. In New York, the Five Points neighborhood and surrounding areas, it was really very much about interaction between Blacks and the Irish, which turned dark because of the draft riots, Civil War time. But when it comes to taking on a fantasy world, what I find fascinating is I know that there are certain speech characteristics that belong to different languages. And I feel free to liberally take, borrow, and do a mashup. I love mashups. If I have a culture that maybe is dominant in their world, a military might, I might take German and Japanese and do a mashup and keep either like the consonants and vowels from German and then, or German and like Nigerian. I would use the rhythm of that sort of African language applied to German consonants or German vowels. So that you're listening and you're going, well, that sounds German, but it's not, because I don't want it to necessarily resonate that one culture. I want it to have its uniqueness.
So much goes on when you're reading prose, reading fictional prose in particular. And I'm gonna play a little clip for you of somebody else reading, not somebody who's a professional reader, but he's a friend of ours. His name is Dennis Duncan. He recently wrote a book that was the entire history of indexes. It was pretty fascinating. But so he wanted to read just a few seconds of the 18th century novel Tristram Shandy. So here we go, Kat. This is B1. This is Dennis Duncan.
Time wastes too fast. Every letter I trace tells me with what rapidity life follows my pen, the days and hours of it, more precious, my dear Jenny, than the rubies about thy neck, are flying over our heads like light clouds of a windy day, never to return more. Everything presses on. Whilst thou art twisting that lock, see, it grows grey, and every time I kiss thy hand to bid adieu, and every absence which follows it, are preludes to that eternal separation which we are shortly to make. Heaven have mercy upon us both.
So, Robin, Dennis is, as I said, not a professional reader of books and everything like that, and he's giving it a pretty straight read, but, a rhythmic, effective read. But there's a way in which you want the author's humor to come out when the humor should come out, and you want the poignance to come out when the poignance should come out. And I guess each reader makes choices too, right? How thick do you lay that on, or how much do you point the reader towards an emotional reaction? Could you say a little bit? I mean, how are you thinking, I guess, about the listener, as who I'm really talking about, the listener, as you're performing or reading a novel?
Oh, wow. That the listener is key because there's a sense of intimacy. I am with you right now in a space. I am reading to you, not to a group of people. I am reading to you. So that's the first thing, is I have to establish a relationship with somebody who isn't physically there with me, which is why I use the projected image of somebody, just like I have a presence with me all the time. That is the receiver of whatever is in the text. Second thing is the sort of fluidity and the connectedness of my thought. I guess I do say this a lot. It's true when I'm teaching. I don't want to perform a book at such a high level of performance, as I said before, that people forget that this is an act of communicating. This has a message. A paragraph may have a message. A chapter may have a tone. And I am charged with communicating that to somebody. There's always a target, that a person. If you forget that, it becomes disconnected. It becomes, look at me performing and how great I do these accents. And I describe it sometimes as a beautiful, long silk scarf that you throw around your neck with a flourish. And you're now saying, look at me wield this scarf. Look at how good I'm at wielding this scarf. And that's not the point. And not at all. You know, if you need to put the scarf on to keep warm, that's great. Have it draped down your front, but go back to communicating what's in the text.
And what's in the text also is, this interview is going to run long. I'm going to get in trouble with McCusker, the producer, because I need to talk to you for a couple hours, actually. But what's in the text is often thought, both with Mary Pat Fennessy in Small Mercies and then the narrator of the fifth season. They're often thinking through a question. And so you are talking to me, the listener, in a kind of mind voice. And I would assume the thing that you just said before, imagining a sort of specific kind of, I don't know, or non-specific generic single listener is important. Like I feel very included in those thoughts in the fifth season somehow of this person that I'll never meet.
Right. Well, one really, I think, important distinction is that in the fifth season trilogy, 3 POVs are employed. Mm-hmm. First person, second person, and third person, depending on where you are. There's not a lot that's written in second person, but that is that inner voice. Mm-hmm. You get up in the morning, you move to the bathroom with your cup, and you drop it, as you always do. You know, that it's the voice in your mind talking you through the thing that's happening. And oftentimes, when do we talk to ourselves? When we're evaluating something, when we're reviewing something. There's a lot of raison d'etres, or maybe I should say raison d'être, like reason to speak. If I'm in a first person section, am I speaking to you? I'm going to try and figure this out from the writing. And most of the time, I think my authors are pretty clear. Is this, do I need absolution from something I've done? Am I seeking absolution? So I need you to grant that. Is this an insider story? Like Devil Wears Prada. I'm on the inside of the fashion industry. You'd never know this if you didn't have me. So sit down, let me talk to you. You know, like that kind of a thing. And that's the same for CSI. Think about our American culture. We are obsessed with CSI, Insider View, ER, the show ER, what goes on in an emergency room. Those are things that a very small select group of people really know. And so those kinds of novels bring that to it. It could be a cautionary tale. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm literally trying to tell you, I've been through this. Don't make the same mistake. If you can sense how the writing is oriented, then you can deliver on that.
All right, we're unfortunately gonna have to stop here, or I really will be executed by the producer. But this is really fascinating, Robin Miles, and you are a legend in the business of audiobooks. It's thrilling to talk to you. And speaking of books, thanks once again. And speaking of books, we're going to end with a little reading by our good friend Taneisha Duggan, who's going to read a speech called "I Memorized Her" from An American Marriage, a novel by the American author Tayari Jones. Here's Taneisha.
Roy. Standing on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, I memorized her. The shape of her lips and the purple tint of her lipstick, which matched the streaks in her hair. I knew her accent, southern but not too much, and I knew her shape. Thick through the hips but slim on top. I had said her name was something old-timey, but I should have said something classic. I can remember the feel of her name in my mouth, like the details of a dream. "I want to see Brooklyn?" she asked. "My other roommate works at 2 steps down. If we go there, we can drink for free." And my first mind was to tell her that we didn't need free cocktails, but I had a feeling she'd be more annoyed than impressed, so I said, "Let's get a taxi." You won't get a taxi tonight.
You can follow The Colin McEnroe Show on Facebook or Twitter at Colin McShow. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to or following our podcast on any podcast app. It's free. You don't have to wait an hour after eating before you go swimming. That's just something our mothers believed. Back to the show.
All right. The technical producer of today's show, we are so fortunate to have Kat Pastor. The producer of this episode is McCusker, and Lily Tyson's our senior producer. We are going to switch gears once again, and interestingly, talk about live readings of the work of maybe the one poet who, as I suggested before, might be one of the very few poets who didn't do live readings. So joining us is Brooke Steinhauser, Programs Director at the Emily Dickinson Museum in Amherst, Massachusetts. Hi, welcome to our conversation.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I mean, I assume I'm right about this. I mean, Emily Dickinson, famously reclusive and not really known in her lifetime as somebody who was writing all these poems. So I assume if anybody ever heard her read them out loud, it would have been maybe immediate family members.
Yeah, she published fewer than 10 poems in her lifetime, and we actually don't think it was really her that was publishing that small handful. It was really, they were published anonymously and likely sent in by friends and family. So yes, her family knew she was a poet. They received poems from her in letters. Whether or not she read them out loud in front of her friends and family, I think is a great question. We do know she read other poetry out loud. She was part of a Shakespeare reading group as a young woman, and it seems from letters that she may have continued reading his work out loud. There's a reference to her reading Antony and Cleopatra in the garret, and the rafters wept.
Yeah, I read about that Shakespeare group, I think, on your museum's website, and that intrigued me, the idea that she was, reading Desdemona or something. But let's talk a little bit about what you do. And I guess there are maybe other places that do this, but the idea is to have a marathon reading of Emily Dickinson poems, of which there are very, very many. How does that unfold?
Yeah, so every fall in September, coinciding with our Tell It Slant Poetry Festival, we have a marathon reading of all 1,789 poems in the Ralph Franklin edition of Emily Dickinson's complete works. This is actually, I think we're coming up on our 20th anniversary of doing this. So the program is as old as the Emily Dickinson Museum is. This is our 20th anniversary year. And it's the marathon has taken on a few different iterations over the years, but it currently takes around about 14 hours to complete. And I think what's unique about our marathon is that it has always been and continues to be a round robin style reading. So anyone, whether they have any experience with reading out loud or reading Emily Dickinson's work out loud or not, can participate, can sign up to be a reader. And we essentially go in a circle with each person reading one poem.
So it's sort of randomly assigned. Do people fight over who gets to read, this thing?
Yeah, we do have folks come in and sometimes they may not know how the marathon works and they ask, can I read this specific poem? It's a favorite of mine. We don't actually, we're not able to honor that because we go in the order again that we're basically sitting, which is arbitrary, and it's just one poem at a time. I think what's really fun about that is you don't know what's coming next. We really want to hear the words in the organic moment in the voice of the reader. We're not bringing on professional readers to do this. And so, so sometimes there's a magical moment where, a poem that is beloved by that reader lands on them, or they have a tattoo of that poem on their arm and they get to read it out loud in the marathon and they're just overjoyed. But, most of the time you just don't know what poem is coming to you next. So there's no sort of advanced preparation, really.
Does anybody ever want to sing one of them to the Yellow Rose of Texas?
No, but I heard your promise at the top of the show. I can't wait to hear yours.
Well, it goes, success is counted sweetest by those who ne'er succeed. To comprehend the nectar requires sorest need. You see how it goes.
Wow, that was amazing.
You're going to spend a lot of time trying to forget that ever happened and get it out of your brain.
Now do the Island theme song.
So, I was also thinking about the fact that although we've never heard, and most people, probably nobody, much of anybody ever heard Emily Dickinson read one of her poems, we are starting to hear somebody pretend to be Emily Dickinson reading a poem, or maybe even composing a poem on the spot. Kat, let's play C1. This is the amazing Haley Steinfeld in the somewhat probably controversial fictional portrayal of Emily Dickinson. Here she is composing a poem on a train.
Before I got my eye put out, I liked as well to see as other creatures that have eyes and know no other way. But were it told to me today that I might have the sky, for mine I tell you that my heart would split for size of me.
Listening to her do that too. Do you ever give anybody any advice about how to read the poem so that you pick a certain cadence, a certain sound? Or are there good practices?
I think for the case of our marathon, again, we really want what is really so effective with that program is the range of voices and delivery. I think there are, in approaching Dickinson's poetry to read out loud, there are definitely choices that a reader needs to make, whether they're making that in advance or whether they're making it on the spot. You just heard Haley Steinfeld, I think, read that poem so beautifully. I think that was one of the real successes of the show, yes. Actually, is the way that the poetry was incorporated. Emily Dickinson uses quite famously a lot of dashes in her poetry. And lots of folks would argue that indicates a sort of reading out loud quality of thoughtful pause, right? Some readers really choose to adhere to that and others do not. Some folks really choose to kind of lean into her common meter. So the reason you can sing almost any of her poems to the Yellow Rose of Texas is that because she is using common meter or hymn meter. So some folks really kind of lean into that almost sing-songy quality, while others really sort of deliberately shy away from that or don't employ that and want to follow more the line of thought across stanzas. So, I think these are all really valid choices. And I think kind of take us to the big question about Dickinson, which is, questions of affect and address, right? Did she want her poems read out loud? Did she write them thinking that they would be read out loud the way that she read Shakespeare out loud? We don't know.
Right. We're going to have to pause there. This is fascinating stuff, though. Brooke Steinhauser is the programs director at Emily Dickinson Museum in Amherst, a short trip from where I'm sitting. Make the trip there. We're going to end with a poem read by our own Chion Wolf. The story behind it is that it's a poem that she sent to a guest on her show, David Myers, Dr. David Myers, who was dying from glioblastoma. It's my understanding that he is now passed. But one of the things that she wanted to share with him, he started asking for poems near the end of his life. So she shared a poem called Blessing by the Irish poet John O'Donoghue. So here's Chion Wolf.
On the day when the weight deadens on your shoulders and you stumble, may the clay dance to balance you. And when your eyes freeze behind the gray window and the ghost of loss gets into you, may a flock of colors, indigo, red, green, and azure blue, come to awaken in you a meadow of delight. When the canvas frays in the choric of thought, and a stain of ocean blackens beneath you, May there come across the waters a path of yellow moonlight to bring you safely home. May the nourishment of the earth be yours. May the clarity of light be yours. May the fluency of the ocean be yours. May the protection of the ancestors be yours. And so may a slow wind work these words of love around you. An invisible cloak to mind your life.